betrayal, it's an incredible flattening of reality. And I think the example you mentioned was, I was saying, a child lying in a nursery, in a crib, and a bird flies into the room. And for the child, this moving, fluttering thing of light and sound is a miracle that has many, many dimensions to it. But the child's mother then comes into the room and sees what's happening, and she says, "It's a bird. It's a bird, baby, bird." So what happens then is this mysterious, irreducible complex of light and motion is changed into a word. And the word is like a little tile. And that word is affixed over the bird and now covers the bird. And by the time you're 6 years old, you've been handed enough of these small tiles that everywhere you look, it's seamless tiling. You have a word, this is a chair, this is a bird, that's the sky, that's the river. And the word robs the thing of its intrinsic ambiguity and magic. And yet the word is how we communicate to each other about the thing. Now we're speaking about the unspeakable, let me point out to those of you who think I wander from the subject. So there's a tension and a paradox there. Reality is most itself in the absence of language, but it can only be communicated through language. Therefore, language is an enterprise in need of perfection. This is the other thing I take out of the DMT thing. This whole business about how they say, do what we are doing, do it, and then you make this glossolalia that I imitated for you, and then you discover that you can make colors and lights and shapes with your voice. This is profound. This is what I call a more perfect logos. Let's analyze what's going on here. First, let's analyze ordinary speech. I want to communicate with you. I have a thought, and I want to communicate it to you. I go into my mind, which is partially my brain, and I seek the culturally, consensually validated words for my idea. I then raise those words to consciousness. I activate my tongue and soft palate, and I create an acoustical pressure wave in the air. This acoustical pressure wave crosses the intervening space between you and me. It enters into your ear. You download this incoming vibration, and you attempt to match it to a dictionary of vibrations that you have learned over your lifetime. Now, if your dictionary matches my dictionary, you extract my thought out of this process. My thought magically comes into existence in your mind. Now, this is called understanding. But notice that one of the most uncool things you can do in most social situations is say to someone, "Would you explain to me what I just said?" This is bad social politics, because it punctures the illusion that we understand each other. I have this all the time because people quote me to myself, and I can often not recognize. Now, notice, let's go back to the DMT flash. The elf creatures, the tykes, I call them, the tykes are using small mouth noises, but they make things you can see. And notice that there is a tremendous gain in coherency. When you and I look at something, let's say we're in an art museum and we're looking at a painting or a sculpture. When you and I look at something, we have high confidence that we are seeing the same thing, generally. Where if I were to read a paragraph and then ask each person to write what I had read, we'd get a whole spectrum of answers. But if I show you a painting and ask everybody to write down what they've seen, the spread will be much less tight. Visual languages have a diminished ambiguity to them. They also, visual languages are not dependent on on culturally validated symbol systems. Notice that if you don't speak English, you can't understand me. But if we're in an art gallery looking at a piece of sculpture, you may speak German and I speak English, but we don't see different things because of this, or we assume we don't see different things because of this. So, having observed all this, I went, the contrast between spoken language and visual language in DMT, I then went to the Amazon, where ayahuasca taking is rampant, and where it's built around the phenomenon of singing, of what are called magical songs, icaros. And when you sit in these ayahuasca circles and you're loaded and people sing these songs, well then after 3 or 4 songs there'll always be a break so people can go outside or smoke or something, and then you hear what the people are saying to each other. And people will say to the shaman who has just finished singing, "I loved your song. I especially loved the part where you put the silver dots on the khaki striping. And I really liked the part where the lemon yellows were faded into the grays." You say, you know, what kind of a conversation is this? We're talking about a song, but it is perceived as a pictorial enterprise. Because under the influence of ayahuasca, sound is processed in the visual cortex, not in the audial center of the brain. And consequently, language is seen. This is why ayahuasca has a reputation for being a telepathic drug. It is a telepathic drug. But telepathy doesn't mean you hear what I think. Telepathy means you see what I mean. And we unconsciously prioritize the visual sense. If you want to say, "I understand you," you say, "I see what you mean." And in all Western languages, if you want to know if you're understood, you say, "Is that clear? Is that clear?" So what this, I believe, means is that language is a behavior in human beings that has not yet completely unfolded developmentally. We now use small mouth noises to communicate, but notice how driven toward the image we are, how much color photography has transformed our world, how much being able to print steel point engravings transformed our world, cinema, television, color television, interactive media, virtual reality. We love to perfect and to relate to images. So I think that part of what these psychedelics are doing, if we say they catalyze the imagination, what we're really saying is that they make language a less audio and more visual enterprise. Now, being a naturalist and a biologist by predilection, whenever I get into these far out places, I try to go back to nature to find a model that fits. Is there a model of visual nature, of visual language anywhere in nature except in the DMT flash? And I discovered one that pleases me very much and makes the point. And I'll lay it on you here. You all probably know from watching endless National Geographic specials that octopi can change color. Octopi can change their color. Most people think this is camouflage, as exists in certain lizards and frogs, where you become the color of the thing you're sitting on and therefore you don't get eaten. That's not what's going on with octopi. Here's the deal, as Ross Perot would say. Octopi are covered on their outer surface by, and first let me say, octopi are large mollusks. They are invertebrates. They divided from our line of evolutionary development 700 million years ago. They are not near neighbors of ours on the evolutionary tree. Compared to an octopus, a dolphin or a whale is like a dog or a cat in its near relative relationship to human beings. Octopi are more closely related to escargot. Okay, so it's a large mollusk, and on the surface of its body it has what are called chromatophores, specialized cells which can change color. It also has the ability to change the surface of its skin from rubbery, shiny, and smooth to goose-pimpled, wrinkled, and rugose. Also, it's soft-bodied. So in an aqueous medium like the sea, the octopus can fold and unfold itself very rapidly. It can reveal and hide parts of its body very rapidly. Well, when you put all this together and study octopi, what you realize is that the color changes, the surface changes, and the rapid shift of visual display is a language. The octopus is its language. It wears language on its surface the way we wear clothes on our surface. The mind of the octopus is on its surface. And one octopus encountering another can tell how long it's been since the other creature has had sex, how long it's been since it's eaten, what kind of a hair day it's having, and so forth and so on. The entire emotional and psychological and intellectual gestalt of the creature is conveyed on its surface. It is its grammar. It is its language. Octopi don't see each other. They see the intent to communicate of each other. And this is so important to cephalopoidal existence that some of these octopi have evolved away from the shallow shorelines of continents and have evolved into the deep parts of the sea, the so-called benthic depths, where no light ever reaches, below 1,500 feet. And in that situation, they have retained their ability to communicate with each other through surface color changes by going to iridescence and phosphorescence. And the benthic octopi even have organs on their bodies, which are like eyelids, that allow them to very, very quickly, at blink rate speed, cover and uncover very bright phosphorescent patches on their skin. In the benthic depths of the sea, there is only occipital grammar. They can't see each other. They can only see the messages that they are sending. It is a domain of purest mind. And I think this is something that we are evolving toward. We already, in distinction to other animals, have a small patch on our bodies that is adapted to doing this. We have what are called faces. Other animals don't have faces. People say their cats and dogs grin, but they only grin. So what kind of an expression is that? We have faces and hundreds of small, delicate muscles through here. And by frowning, widening the eyes, flaring the nostrils, opening the mouth, we convey subtly an entire gestalt of emotions, social changes, and attitudes that adumbrate and augment our spoken language. I think our drive into the mind to communicate is so intense that we are, through our technologies, following in the steps of the cephalopodia and attempting to try and create a culture whose surface is syntactical and grammatical. And when we succeed in doing this, the difference between us as distinct individuals will be much less important. This is what I call the task of history. The task of history is for the human beings to turn themselves inside out. Let's get the mind onto the surface and get the body interiorized as a freely commandable object in the imagination. That is the inversion that we are attempting to create. When that can be done, then we will be in hyperspace. We will have transcended three-dimensional Newtonian space, which is the space where the body resides and climbs around, and we will be in the mental space of the imagination. And this is what we're attempting to do by manifesting culture. You know, we talk about virtual reality, and, you know, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Notice that all human reality is virtual. If by virtual reality what we mean is the downloading of human ideas into a domain of presentation, then this hotel is a virtual reality. The city of Lahaina or Manhattan is a virtual reality. The American government is a virtual reality. Money is a virtual reality. These are all exteriorized ideological systems in which we walk around in and give our belief to, in the same way that we give our belief to the existence of mountains, oceans, and trees. And yet these are ideas that we have virtually caused to come into existence by using matter as the substrate onto which to project these things. And essentially, as a species, we are the idea-excreting species. Other animals may have ideas, but they certainly don't manifest them. I mean, the whale sings its song, but it's a far cry from that to the World Trade Center or the American Museum of Natural History or an international airport somewhere. We manifest ideas, and as psychedelics catalyze ideas and catalyze language, it's becoming ever more concrete. And I think eventually there will be a marriage between human beings, technology, and pharmacology that will erase the boundaries between us and plunge us into a telepathic plenum that will not be magical. It will simply be image-mediated and trans-individual. And this is what we're plunging toward. This is what the culmination of history is the creation of a collective human overmind that can then direct the human species in an appropriate way. In other words, a hive of bees has a collective overmind, and bees don't pollute the environment or dig up petroleum or do all of these destructive things because it is ultimately inappropriate to the existence of bees to do this. We, by fragmenting into 4 billion individual egos, have lost the overstructure, the grand plan of things. And this is how it is possible that we can be damaging the earth and looting our children's future. We are not planning for the life of the species in a coherent way, and this is because we cannot communicate to each other sufficiently the nature of the problem and the path toward a solution. And here is where the psychedelics come in. They will connect us to the Gaian mind. They will connect us to each other. They will connect us to transverbal styles of communication that are beheld rather than heard. And in so doing, they will create of us a superorganism that is worthy of the human enterprise and worthy of the effort to rarefy and condense spirit that is going on this planet. The pieces of the equation, human beings, psychoactive plants, technology, are all now on the table. And it's simply a matter of being aware of what is possible and assembling the pieces and putting them together and creating a new kind of reality. That's what we're talking about. It's on its way, but it needs to be guided by psychedelic intent and by a consciousness of the real intrinsic worth of human beings. Well, that's enough for this morning. I just got carried away, and you have bladders of extraordinary durability, totaler by any means, but I do most of my substances straight. I don't mix things too much. I can't imagine what possible argument there could be for using alcohol in the presence of hallucinogens, unless you were in a situation where, like, maybe you took LSD and you had a 1967 Puy-Fumé Chateau Languedoc and you wanted to, you know, explore it. But otherwise, I would think it was not such a good idea. Yeah. What do I think of ecstasy? Well, that's a complicated question. Well, first of all, I think that it's, in terms of its psychoactivity, it has a definite role to play in getting people in touch with their emotions and their interpersonal stuff. However, most psychedelics, if you believe it's going to give you an insight into your personal dilemma, it will do so. I'm suspicious of all synthetic drugs simply because we don't have enough data. In other words, you know, MDMA has not been taken in great amounts before 1975. So we don't know what the long-term consequences of exposure to it is. With a compound like psilocybin, it's been used for thousands of years in the Mexican highlands. We know that it doesn't cause blindness, miscarriage, madness, Parkinson's syndrome, whatever. In thinking about drugs, I mean, let me broaden the question. Here's how I evaluate a potential substance that I'm thinking about using for self-exploration. I say, first of all, does it occur in a plant? If it occurs in a plant, then it's part of the great ocean of organic life that has been elaborated over billions of years, and it has a morphogenetic field that is compatible with life. So that's the first question. Does it occur in a plant? But of course, you know, you can kill yourself with plants, no question about it. Strychnos nox vomica, Amanita phalloides, henbane, no problem to kill yourself with plants. So there has to be a further filter, and that is, Does it have a history of human usage? If it has a history of human usage, you automatically have your human data. You know that it's benign, or you know under what circumstances it's benign. And then thirdly, and this is the more narrow of the filters, I think it should have an affinity with ordinary brain chemistry. We don't want to insult the physical brain any more than you want to hit your thumb with a hammer. We don't want to put something toxic in the brain. So the least toxic things are those most structurally akin to neurotransmitters. So that leaves DMT and psilocybin, LSD to some degree. These things are very closely related to serotonin, the main neurotransmitter running the brain. So strangely enough, if you apply all these limiting filters to your choice of substances, you will still be left with the best and the strongest. I don't think that psychedelic sophistication consists of having taken every drug there is. What it consists of is having a deep relationship with the substance that you personally have found to be the one that fits your psychology and somatology most comfortably. So, you know, there are numerous substances that I haven't tried because I don't think we need a new drug. I think if the things we have are perfectly adequate to any conceivable task or goal in this domain. I mean, we don't need hallucinogens more powerful than DMT, so forth and so on. Returning to the question of MDMA, it is true that it has a visible impact on microfine structures of the nerve called dendritic spines, and at doses that are not greatly higher than the effective dose. So that's a cautionary note. MDMA is in the family of the cyclicized amphetamines, which also include MDA and mescaline, which is a naturally occurring compound. But all of those compounds have the kind of profile that would cause a pharmacologist to want to be cautious. And let me explain a little pharmacology here to you. Pharmacologists have a concept that they call LD50. Now this is a nasty idea, but you should assimilate it anyway. LD50, LD stands for lethal dose. LD50 means you have 100 mice and you give them dose X and half of them die. That's the LD50. That dose is the LD50. When 50% of the animal sample dies, that's the LD50. Now, what you want in a hallucinogen, or in any drug, an antibiotic, an antihistamine, anything, what you want is a drug where the effective dose is very, very low compared to the LD50, you see. Now, the most extreme example by this measurement of a safe drug is LSD. Because LSD is active at 50 micrograms, 50 millionths of a gram. The LD50 has never been determined for human beings. In other words, no one knows how much LSD you would have to take to kill 50% of the human sample. It's orders and orders of magnitude. Psilocybin, by contrast, the effective dose is 20 milligrams. 20 milligrams. The LD50 of psilocybin is something like 800 milligrams per kilogram. Can you imagine how much psilocybin that is? So psilocybin is relatively safe. Now, when you go to these cyclicized amphetamines, the picture doesn't look so good. The LD50 for mescaline is only 20 times the effective dose. This is an indication at least that you should slow down and consider what's going on. So I favor drugs with low LD50s. The LD50, high differentials. The LD50 for DMT is not known, simply not known. Yeah, it's never been determined, and must be enormously high because it's a neurotransmitter, you know. For MDMA, it's again in the range of 20 times the effective dose. It may be lower. I mean, and it is true, as I mentioned, that these things called dendritic spines are sheared off, are ablated by MDMA. Now, you can take two positions on this. The conservative position says, well, my God, from one dose to another, you can see that this stuff is impacting the physical brain. Therefore, it shouldn't be taken. The less conservative position builds its case on the fact that, yes, but no behavioral consequences seem to flow from this ablation of the dendritic spines. In other words, there's no argument that it occurs, but the test animals do not display any symptom of impairment, nor do human subjects who have later been shown to have experienced this ablative phenomenon. So it's something where you must inform yourself and then make the decision. Personally, I don't think that MDMA does anything that other compounds with better profiles can't do with nearly equal ease. I don't see it as providing a unique pharmacological function. And I'm not saying this as a put-down of MDMA, but throughout this century, the introduction of every new psychoactive drug has been accompanied by the hype that it was a love drug. And it came in different forms, you know. LSD was a love drug. Marijuana, when it hit white people, was presented as an aphrodisiac. Psilocybin, presented as a love drug. Even cocaine is said to increase sexual prowess and so forth. So it's a marketing strategy, I think. I think MDMA is very effective in the hands of a therapist with somebody with a problem, but as a lifestyle, I think psychedelic people would quickly grow quite bored with that. Over here.
On that same vein, do you know of any long-term effects on the dendrites regarding the serotonin levels with extended use of hallucinogens? Is there any implication for serotonin level lowering or raising or side receptors or anything like this that you are aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that would be a very, very interesting question to pursue. As somebody who has taken a huge number of these things over a lifetime, I wonder occasionally about my serotonergic system and exactly what's going on. This leads to a sort of a peculiar topic, this whole thing about the serotonergic system. Last night I didn't get to it in my talk. I talked about salvia divinorum, but it was actually only one of 4 items on a list called new developments. Second on that list, and you may not have expected to ever hear this word pass my mouth, second on the list was Prozac. Prozac is, first of all, remember, if you haven't taken a drug, your opinion is worthless, even when it's a drug you don't like. Prozac targets the serotonergic system in exactly the same way the hallucinogens do. And here's how it works. When the nerve fires, the synaptic cleft is flooded with serotonin. Normally, that serotonin is immediately uptaken into the synaptic vesicle. In the presence of Prozac, it is not reuptake. That doesn't occur. So the synapse remains saturated in serotonin. And I think it's very interesting that these drug companies have gone to work on this particular system. It's very clear to me that what they're trying to do is create a drug which has the effect of having taken 500 mics of acid and wrestled with your soul all night long, except that you don't. You don't. It comes very slowly. I don't know if you know, but Prozac builds up in your system. You take it for 15 days before it reaches saturation. Then when you stop taking it, it takes 15 days to leave your system. I'm interested in it because I'm beginning to wonder if this dysfunctionality that I've identified stemming from the absence of psilocybin for the past 10,000 years in the human diet may actually have resulted in a lot of us are running around with impaired serotonergic systems. There's much too much depression, mood swing, mania, paranoia, and general unhappiness in the human population. And rather than lay it on to stress or bad upbringing, or, you know, as has been the tendency in the past, I'm beginning to think a lot of it is actually somatic and possibly genetic, and that Prozac is an effort to essentially tune this serotonergic system that has an effect very similar to the effect that psychedelics have, but without ever putting the person through the dramatic episode of the boundary-dissolving intoxication. And I'm sure we will hear more about these kinds of drugs because the Lilly company holds the absolute patent on Prozac, fluoxetine hydrochloride, and other companies are rushing to fill this gap. And I'm interested to talk to psychedelic audiences about it for a couple of reasons. First of all, I notice there's a huge amount of Prozac bashing going on in the ordinary press. I mean, it's dismissed as a happy pill and for people who are non-functional and vegetative and a cop-out and this and that. And I didn't read the book listening to Prozac, but as I try to understand this debate, the argument seems to be it's a terrible thing to take a drug which alters your personality. And what does that mean? That the self is chemically based? Well, but hey, folks, haven't we all been potheads since the year zero? Didn't we cross this bridge long ago? Haven't we come to terms with the issue of whether or not we're presenting a natural or artificial personality? It seems to me this is just something straight people have to come to terms with, but heads should have no problem with it. We understand that personality is as changeable as hairdo or fashion. I don't know how I got off on that tear. Oh, the serotonergic system, yeah.
What do you think the implications, since we have, you know, the effects of, for example, Prozac, of the increase and stabilization of the serotonin levels with the augmentation of hallucinogens?
You mean how does Prozac work with hallucinogens? Is that the question?
Yes, that's, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. I saw my brother at Christmas time and we spent a long evening talking about this because you would think that this enriching of the synaptic environment with serotonin would have an inhibitory effect on hallucinogens, just knowing what we know about how these systems work. This does not appear to be the case. In other words, if you're taking Prozac, it does not diminish your response to hallucinogens, which is good news and also counterintuitive to how you would think this all might work. Anybody? Yeah, over here, Richard.
Isn't there something about taking some vitamins with the Prozac that there made some effect or something?
I haven't heard that. Before we leave the subject of Prozac, though, there's one more thing I should tell you, and I tell you this in the interest of, that I don't believe, well, just in the interests of education and information, but what you make of this is your own business. This problem with MDMA that I mentioned, the ablation of the dendritic spines, is blocked by Prozac. And it's blocked by Prozac even if you're not taking Prozac in the ordinary way, which is 20 milligrams a day. But if you just take 20 milligrams 6 hours before you take MDMA, this ablation of the dendritic spines will not occur, because apparently the toxin which is ablating the dendritic spines is in that molecular species of serotonin that is reuptaken. And if you block the reuptake of serotonin that is quote-unquote contaminated by MDMA, then you won't have the dendritic spine ablation, and you will have the MDMA trip. So there are pharmacological strategies for dealing with this, but I wouldn't try this at home, folks. This is, academic stuff. Over here.
Well, I was in a conversation with Dr. Augustus Osley a few years ago, and we were talking about ecstasy, and he advised me never to take it because of the fact that it will lower and affect your spinal fluid, actually in the spine, and cause fluctuations there. He said he would never touch it.
Well, I haven't heard that. I don't like dumping on it outright, but I guess what speaks louder than words is I don't take it. But a lot of people have had wonderful experiences on it. Marriages have been saved and launched, although I'm not sure that's a good thing. But as I say, this is part of educating yourself and deciding, where you want to put your money in this game. Yeah, you.
Speaking of money, last night you were advocating that everybody should do DMT, but aside from it being illegal and pretty much unobtainable, isn't it also excessively costly?
No, I don't think it's excessively costly, because let's see, a gram runs around $200. Now let me figure here for a minute. If 50 milligrams is a dose, then a gram has 20 doses in it. At $200, that's $20 a dose. If we compare it to air flight, that's like being able to fly to Bombay for 35 cents. So, and also, let me say, DMT is not a drug of abuse. I know people who scored a gram in 1970 and still haven't hit the halfway mark with it, and are planning basically to hand it on to their great-grandchildren. So, I think as an investment, it looks pretty good.
The experiences that you described also immediately, you could do it again 10 minutes later and you'd still have the same experience.
Well, that's an interesting question. The official answer is yes. There is no tolerance that can be measured by physiological parameters, which is what you would expect from a neurotransmitter. In my own experience, it's good to wait at least 12 hours. The second trip never attains this incredibly intense peak if you follow it 10, 15, 20 minutes later. But it's still very dramatic, no doubt about it. I would say in terms of tolerance, the tolerance is, there's very little buildup of tolerance to it.
said you had a list of 4 new developments. You gave us 2.
Oh, let me go back to my notes from last night. Oh, well, I did mention a little bit about the third item, which is these ayahuasca analogs. That this is a whole new frontier for people of an alchemical and botanical bent to try and locate plants in your environment that contain DMT and then brew up pseudo-ayahuascas and take them. The DMT source that's causing a lot of excitement in this area is a plant that grows across the Midwest called Desmanthus illinoisensis. It has a very high concentration of DMT in the root bark, and it's basically a weed of the prairies, Illinois bundleweed. If you combine that with Pegamen harmala, you get a rip-roaring hallucinogenic experience. There are also some grasses, Phalaris tuberosa, Phalaris arundinaceae. They contain DMT with very few other analogs present. There are anodonanthera trees in the tropics and even in the subtropics. They're probably here, probably used as landscaping. They certainly are in Puerto Rico, yeah.
What do? You just grind up the illinoisensis thing and the harmala stuff?
And cook it together. Cook it together, boil it for an hour, strain out the solid matter, concentrate the liquid, fast 6 hours, and take it in silent darkness.
Just water, boil it in water.
Boil it in water. That's a sufficient solvent. Yes, you want to stay away from high molecular weight solvents or you'll blow yourself to kingdom come. And water is usually good enough for these things. Yeah.
This has to do with the 5-MeO-DMT. I've heard reports from bystanders that while I was gone, my body did very strange things, waiting for me to come back. Convulsions, jerky, large movements, moving around uncontrolled. Is there, what is this? A little frightening to hear all those reports.
Well, I've seen people take 5-MeO-DMT and just lie quiet and still. I've also, a surprising number of people vomit, which seems to me not a good sign. I don't know. I mean, there's never been a human response study of 5-MeO-DMT. If you want to read the new human response study on DMT, it's in the latest journal of neuropharmacology. A 20-page review article, fascinating stuff. But this twitching that goes on, the presentation that people give on DMT can vary widely. I told you about the lady who had the full body orgasm. That was definitely, I've only seen that once, but I have seen people do squirm, they do moan. Some people yell like crazy, which is very disconcerting. I mean, it presents you, the facilitator, with this crazy problem, because here they are howling to beat the band, and you don't know whether you should say, you know, please stop, or you don't want to interfere with their thing, but you're thinking, you know, if somebody comes to the front door, can I pass this off as sex, or what is going on? People do carry on, and I suppose I'm the worst of all, because when I do it, I have come, it didn't used to be this way, but now I almost always pass over into glossolalia and just spontaneously articulate this language-like phenomenon. I can't stop myself. It's so sensual or orgasmic to do it that it just seems the natural. But, you know, people watching it, it's alarming to people. I mean, when I did it this morning, I do it briefly and it has a humorous intent, but if you're in the presence of it for 5 minutes, it begins to raise certain questions that are disquieting. Know what I mean? I'm sure you do know that. Yes?
Your voice?
Oh, it's not. It's been released on CD. The CD they were selling last night called Alien Dreamtime, I think cut 4 is is me doing glossolalia for about 600 people backed by didgeridoo and synthesizer last February at the Paradise Lounge in San Francisco. Of course. There's one left, folks. No pushing, please. Yeah.
Is DMT legal anywhere?
Is DMT legal?
And can you buy it, like, if I go to another country?
I'm not sure. There's this thing which exists called the International Convention on Narcotics that the UN holds the signatories to. And I'm not sure what the status is. I mean, ayahuasca is legal in Brazil. Ayahuasca runs on DMT. I know of certain medical preparations that are sold over the counter in Mexico that have high concentrations of DMT. But whether or not you could just simply sell pure crystalline DMT in a foreign country and have it be legal, I don't really know. I imagine not, or there would be more DMT around. Yeah.
Use those medical preparations from Mexico as a source of DMT?
You could for an ayahuasca analog. You could, yes. I'll tell you what it is. I can't remember what it's called. It's some 11-syllable word like Chihaxwaxicuatl or something like that. But it's for burns. And it's a brown powder, and it's made from the roots of Mimosa hostiles, which is traditionally listed as a DMT source in the pharmacopoeias. So that is a possibility, yeah. Yeah, up here, let's get in the back.
What's the chemical name for the toadstool?
5-methoxy-DMT, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine. Yeah.
Could you get into like the effects of DMT, smoking it while you're already on like an MAO inhibitor or on another drug? And are there any people who are into this, doing experiments, saying what happens when you're on one and doing the other, or anything like that? Or most people who are in the mind like, oh, we're doing DMT?
Well, maybe you should hold forth on that. No, well, I used to, in the 60s and 70s, I was very keen to prolong DMT trips. And one strategy that we hit on was to smoke it at the height of LSD flashes. Now this seems to me somewhat reckless and hairy-chested, but on the other hand, many of you are young, so... And it does prolong it, it does change it. I mean, some of you have heard me tell this story. I was in Berkeley one Thanksgiving, and I was the manager of a rooming house, and everybody had gone home for Thanksgiving. And I took LSD, and then at the height of the trip, I smoked DMT, and it went on and on and on. It was very exfoliated and extensive. And right at the extended peak of it, this woman that I rented to, who I thought had gone home to Missouri for Christmas, arrived by cab and came charging up the front steps of the house, let herself into the front door, and ran around and started beating on my bedroom door. Well, I'm the kind of person that if I'm 600 miles up a jungle river and I'm smoking a bomber and I hear a leaf fall, I immediately hide the door and look around to see what's going on. So her beating on the door, I like had a heart attack or something, and I jumped up off the bed in the middle of this DMT flash, and I like landed on my feet, and when I looked around, I realized that I had dragged these things with me into the space, and I had an elf hanging off each hand, and they were ricocheting off the walls, and it was just like complete horror and disbelief, and the most dramatic thing that was going on was there was this weird machine hovering in the air of my room with a kind of faceted top on it, and it was ratcheting around. It was making this loud metallic click, like click, click, and every time it would do that, a triangular shaped piece of plastic would be ejected from it and sail across the room, and I noticed they had alien letters on them. And these plastic chits are ricocheting off the wall and landing on the floor, and I staggered to the door of my room, and I pulled it open, and I said something in Martian to this woman, and then closed the door and ran back to the bed and literally put my head under the covers and just lay there breathing and let it become an eyes closed trip, and then watched it slowly fade, and then just lay there for a long, long time. So I guess the answer is it gets highly anomalous, highly unpredictable. You know, when you combine drugs, it's what's called a synergy. And these things are completely unexplored. I mean, it's hard enough to say what LSD and psilocybin does when you start talking about how, well, we started out with 4 ounces of Robitussin, and then we moved into a little vitamin K, and after that, they passed around the mushrooms. And then you say, how was it? Say, hey, it was far out. No question about it, but I don't know if the rest of us can ever diddle our way back there. Inhibiting MAO and smoking DMT is the way to extend it, but boy, you better have your chops together. I mean, it's like deep diving on the reef at night, and, you know, over here.
What about vitamin K? What could you tell us about
Vitamin K, ketamine, it's a dissociative anesthetic used in veterinary medicine. I'm not terribly keen on it. It fails all the tests I laid out for you. It doesn't occur in a plant. It doesn't have a history of usage by native peoples, and it doesn't occur as a neurotransmitter. Still, I will have to say, it gets you more stoned than almost anything else. It gets you so stoned that you lose the concept of stoned, which is a strange experience where you say, what is this? And then there's no answer. And then later you say, it's a drug. You say, oh, it's a drug. I got it. Now I remember. I'm lying on the floor of somebody's apartment. I'm a human being. I'm having a psychedelic trip. This is the trip. Now I understand. And then you can sort of get hold of it. But it's, there are some strikes against it. There's some evidence that it triggers epileptic kindling. That means lowers your threshold for seizure. There's also some evidence that it lowers your immune response, which God knows that's the last thing most of us need at this point. I found it very hard to bring much out of it, but it does have its enthusiasts. They're very vocal. Again, this is just a matter of taste, what you like and what you don't. Yeah.
With the emergence of psychoneuroimmunology as a sort of exciting new field, what impact do you think the hallucinogens you've been familiar with has on the whole immunologic axis, neuroimmunologic axis, and is there any data or evidence?
I'm sure there's no data because I'm sure it hasn't been looked at. I think that the place where natural laws might break down is inside the human body, because the human mind is such a peculiar adumbration of natural law. I am a rationalist, actually. I mean, my opinions are based on, I am a rationalist, and I'm a show-me kind of guy, and I don't believe in miracles. Nevertheless, I have seen things which suggest that language is primary and reality is secondary, and that there are ways to make the world be what you want it to be. As an example of what I'm talking about, I am aware of a situation, a person who was a psychotherapist, MD, and had been injured in an accident that had left an arm paralyzed, and was suing somebody over this accident. And consequently, there was a huge amount of medical data before the court about this injury, x-rays and expert testimony and so forth, and everybody agreed this guy would never regain the use of this arm. And in 6 sessions of smoking DMT, he was able to regain complete use of the arm and dropped the suit and went on with his life. You know, it could have been done with holy water from Lourdes, I'm aware of that, but it's just anecdotal data that suggests that mind is primary, especially in the matter of health, when we're talking about moving energy fields around inside the body. And I have heard stories, you hear stories, but you just don't know what to believe, you know? I mean, I heard a story about somebody wounding themselves with a machete and taking a substantial hit of LSD and basically just zipping it shut with the gesture of the hand. But, you know, unless you see it, if it contravenes reason, I don't think you want to believe it. You don't say it doesn't happen, you just say, you know, I wasn't there. Yeah.
What do you think of
Ibogaine is the 4th item on my list of exciting new developments.
How do you spell that?
Ibogaine. Ibogaine is an alkaloid, a hallucinogen, an indole, an authentic member of the family, about which very little is known. It comes from the root bark of an African tree and is the basis of a religion in Gabon and Cameroon and the Congo called Bwiti, where the style of taking it is very similar to the approach to ayahuasca in the Amazon. You could almost say it's an African equivalent, folk analog to ayahuasca. It is also rumored to be an aphrodisiac, a true aphrodisiac, meaning that most things which are said to be aphrodisiacs are in fact either cause prolonged erection or genital itching or something like that. In other words, they're somewhat peripheral to the real sexual response. Ibogaine isn't. I mean, Ibogaine is very interesting because if you're in a non-sexual context and you take it, sex is not an issue. But if you are in a situation where making love is an option, then this stuff is deep water and opens up ahead of you and is an extraordinary enhancer of performance and perception. But that's not what is so interesting all of a sudden. What's so interesting is that a number of people are going around claiming that if you predose rats addicted to heroin with Ibogaine, that they lose all interest in heroin. And this same response seems to be true for cocaine. And anecdotally, it seems to be true for human beings. And so NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, has recently funded a multi-million-dollar study of Ibogaine as a possible cure for hard drug addiction. I love this notion that you could cure hard drug addiction with, of course, a drug. It had to be, didn't it? So we'll see where this leads. In any case, you should know, since probably few of us have a heroin problem, that this is a great hallucinogen and a great enhancer of sex, and very little is known about it. The usage of it in Africa is even not well understood because there is no record of it being used before 1860. And yet the areas of Africa where it's indigenous, the Portuguese have been in there since the 1430s. So just suddenly, in the late 19th century, this thing like emerges de novo. So that's very interesting, and it needs to be studied, and its structural near relatives need to be studied. The amount of human pain and misery that could be alleviated if we would fairly meet the challenge that these plants present us. I mean, we have cures for depression, impotence, mood swings, all of the psychological tattering that we're subject to could potentially be corrected through psychoactive drugs, and yet we're not looking at this. You know, drug companies are fearful, commercial and market forces mitigate against it, and people are miserable. As an example, along the lines of ibogaine, but in another part of the world, in Thailand, there's a plant called Mitragyna speciosa. And it's been known for a couple of hundred years that people in Thailand who are addicted to opium, peasants, country people, take this plant to get off opium addiction. Well, it's called kratom in Thailand. Well, none of us have ever heard of it. But if you go to Thailand and ask about it, they'd say, oh, terrible, very addicting, will completely ruin your life. We have a national program to eradicate this tree. It's very highly illegal. Well, isn't it peculiar that this government, which is reaping multi-billion-dollar benefits from the heroin trade, is just frantically interested in wiping out this terrible menace, the Mitragyna speciosa tree? Very bizarre. Yeah.
Staying on that ibogaine just a little bit, I was wondering if you could speak a little about the dosage near the LD50 kind of idea, and because a friend of mine, or not a friend, but a friend of a friend, so I don't know about the story exactly, but recently in Florida was administered through people who supposedly knew what was going on, and then 5 days later this guy had to be brought to the hospital and brought down with all kinds of heavy chemicals, and then we had to even go back again for more of that, and still it's not completely returned from this.
From a heavy ibogaine trip.
Right, so was it possible he was overdosed and that he suffered a severe psychotic break?
Well, I'm not sure that the LD50 in human beings has ever been determined. It's probably known for rats. Not very much is known about ibogaine. The way it's done in Gabon is they say, the Bawitists, the practitioners of this religion, that you have to split open your head with it. And they force feed people huge amounts of this ground root bark, and people do die. But I don't know why they think that they have to take so much. They say once you've opened your head, you never have to take that much again. One thing you have to do, I mean, and this may seem contradictory, but you have to take what everybody says with a grain of salt. Even the shaman, even the upriver people. I mean, I've experimented with ibogaine, and my approach was completely rational. I just kept taking larger and larger doses until I could feel it. And I found it to be an extraordinarily interesting and fairly easy compound to take. In other words, what's going on with it that seemed to me to make it different from others is, and I think this ties into the so-called aphrodisiac part, is you feel more comfortable than you've ever felt in your life. Whatever the word comfortable means to you, this stuff makes you comfortable. And that gives you an extraordinary ease and fluidity and gentleness and like that. But you know, just because somebody is an African tribe doesn't mean they can't be tweaked or bent by the forces of cultural history. So that's why it's good, I think, to use pharmacological approaches and to use the ethnographic data to check where you are, but to basically, I was thinking this morning as I brushed my teeth, for some reason I was thinking, whenever possible, we should believe science. It's just that we should admit that it's not always possible, you know. But on minor matters, on these kinds of matters, science is a reliable indicator. Dosages, LD50s, this is the sort of stuff where they shine. It's when you try and get the implications together that science fails. Yeah?
How do you feel about, in relationship to the ayahuasca analogs, brewing ayahuasca non-traditionally? Because the books I've read, the experience you have is very much affected by the person that brews it and how they go about it. So how do you feel about this?
That's an interesting question. Yes, it raises a whole bunch of issues. Let me lay this out here. Many of the things that we've talked about here, like mushrooms, ibogaine, peyote, morning glory seeds, these are naturally occurring hallucinogens that you simply grind up and take, and then whatever happens, happens. Remember, I said this morning that ayahuasca was a combination of two plants, one to inhibit the MAO, the other to provide a psychedelic compound for the trip. What I'm describing there is not then a plant exactly, but a drug in the sense of a preparation. It was made by somebody. It didn't grow in the jungle. The materials grew in the jungle, but it was made by somebody. And how well or poorly they made it is going to determine how good it is. And so then we come to the question you asked, the question about what about non-traditional brewing of ayahuasca? Here again, this is how I rely on science. It is not simply true that the most primitive, most bare-assed, most upriver people are the ones you can trust. That's actually a kind of racism, an unconscious form of racism. The shaman that you're looking for may be a naked Indian, but it well could be a mestizo living on the edge of a huge city in the Amazon. It is not necessarily the most primitive level of culture where the highest level of understanding resides. I've taken ayahuasca all over the Amazon, and it's different every time. And it's different because the people make it differently. And there are many dimensions to this problem. I mean, imagine, here's what you've got. You've got a bottle of brown liquid that it's taken you 12 hours to make, and it's worth 120 soles, let's say. Well, now if you cut it with water, 50%, you now have 2 bottles of brown liquid, each worth 120 soles. The temptation to water it is great. Also, just like here, there are a lot of people who are into shuck and jive. There are a lot of ayahuasqueros whose goal, I think, is to get just a little bit buzzed. They're not really going for the gold, you know. They really don't want the reality obliterating experience. So you have to sort all this out. And quite frankly, you know, unless you're very well connected, you'll drink a lot of swill before you hit the main vein. I certainly did. And then once I came out of the Amazon and to a place where I could work on the problem of ayahuasca in a legal environment, my farm in Paraguay, I had the shaman's recipes, but I proceeded as though I didn't. I just started making it stronger and stronger and stronger until I got it the way I wanted it, and manipulating both components. And when I got it exactly the way I wanted it, then I brewed it according to the shaman's recipe, and then I compared them and saw that they were roughly equivalent. But the guy that I learned to make ayahuasca from really made his stuff stiff, and so I was able to duplicate that. Some of you may know the books of Manuel Córdoba Rios, or the books of S. Bruce Lamb about Manuel Córdoba Rios. In the Rio Tigre and beyond, there's a story he tells about going out collecting rosewood oil, which is something you have to go way into the jungle to get, and it's probably an ecological atrocity to collect it at all, but let's leave that out of the picture for a minute. Anyway, they were collecting rosewood oil and came upon some very uncontacted people who invited them to take ayahuasca with them. And they did, and it was garbage. And after the whole thing was over with, he said, you know, you guys don't know what you're doing. Let me show you how I make it. And he made it for them, and they were ready to enshrine him as a cultural benefactor. He said, my God, 10,000 years we've been doing it wrong. You showed us the right way. So you never know who knows. Yeah.
I wondered if you have had any experience with the Solanese, particularly Datura.
That's an interesting family to talk about. This is a slightly different chemical group. The question is about the Solanaceae, which are the Daturas, the Brugmansias, the arborescent Daturas with the big pendulous hanging flowers that are used by landscapers. These plants are saturated with a family of chemicals called tropanes. Hyoscyamine, L-hyoscyamine, scopolamine, the Nazi truth serum, all of these things are in these. And those of you who have read the early books of Carlos Castaneda, there's a lot in there about Jimson weed. This, well, these are not indoles, these are tropanes. And they are psychoactive and interesting. I don't know how much is to be learned there. It seems to me it's a path of power, and it's also a path of danger. They're quite peculiar, and it's hard to keep control. It's the drug where people invariably tear their clothes off and run into public. I mean, I don't know why they do that, but just over and over again, you hear stories of people taking their clothes off and then going into public. My period of Datura experimentation is somewhat in the past. In Nepal, there is Datura metal, which is the conspecific species to Datura metalloides in North America. And we would grind it up and take the seeds, and it's freaky. It doesn't teach you about higher consciousness. It sort of leads you into a world of twilight confusion and magical and somewhat demonic forces. As an example, I mean, here's what happened to me. I took this stuff, and I was sitting alone in my room at Bodhanath, and there's this, you're waiting, right? You're waiting for this drug to work. And it's like, it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. And then you fall into some kind of weird reverie where you've like taken your attention away from the problem of the drug working, and you fall into a kind of twilight sleep. And what happened to me was these strange wraith-like forms, almost like Victorian ghosts. These wraith-like forms were flowing in through the window, vaguely female, and each one was carrying a large sheet of newsprint. And as my head would fall into my lap, these pieces of newsprint would float down into my lap, and I would find myself reading words. And as I read the words, amazement would begin to take hold in my mind, and it would cause me to jerk out of this state, and then there would be nothing going on. You say, it's not working, but what was that? Then I would fall back into it. It would happen again. The other thing then, later in the trip that happened was, and this was a little more disconcerting, I would like briefly lose consciousness, and then come to and discover that I'd thrown my leg up around my neck and I had my arm, and I was into one of these trips, you know. Say, okay. Very carefully uncoil yourself and lay back down on the mat, and then 5 minutes later it would happen again. And this maybe happened 10 times. And I thought to myself, boy, I'm sure glad there's nobody here to see this, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets people riled up and they assume you're dying and that something has to be done. Where if you're alone, you know, you either come through it or you die. But in any case, you avoid a fuss. And then the other thing that was interesting, and this is a typical Datura story, you always hear these kinds of stories, was I was neighbors with an English guy. And to get to the John, you had to go through his bedroom. And he had also decided to take Datura that night. And though he and I were friends, we both had an interest in this French woman with a ring in her nose named Angelique. So finally I had to go to the John. So I walked into Dave's room, and as I passed the bed, I saw that he was actually in bed with this girl. And this caused a complex emotion in me. But I went forward and I went to the John and took care of all that. And then when I came back through, there they were again. So then I went back to my room and finished off the trip. And the next morning, when he and I were comparing notes, I said, well, Dave, it looks like you edged me out in the matter of Angelica, because I saw you last night. And he said, yes, I thought we made love for hours, but you know, she wasn't there at all. And so it was a very weird situation. I saw his hallucination. We were existing in some kind of space where you couldn't tell shit from shinola, essentially. And then what finally convinced me to lay this all aside after the Angelica incident was there was another English guy in this village, and he was also taking Datura a lot. And every day I would shop for potatoes and tomatoes, the only two things you could buy in this village. So I was out doing that, and I came upon this guy, and we're talking, the gossip of the village. And as I'm talking to him, I slowly realized that he thinks I'm visiting him in his apartment. He thinks we're 5 blocks away and 3 floors up in his room. And we're actually down in the marketplace buying potatoes and tomatoes. And at that point I said, you know, this is getting too boundaryless and wiggy and peculiar, and I think we'll just fold the Datura effort at this time. So that was the Datura story. A lot of sorcery goes on around Datura, especially in Latin America. And there may be ways to approach it which are not so risky. I mean, some people say the way to do it is simply grow the plant near your bedroom window so that you can breathe that heavy perfume as you sleep, and that it will cause dreams. Other people say, you know, you don't take it internally. My God, it's too strong for that. What you do is you take the leaves or the flowers and you make a paste, and you rub it on your third eye before you go to sleep, and then you just lie there and let it absorb. But it's a strange world, a world of shadows and forces and shifting boundaries and uncertain, you know, you never know exactly where you're at with that stuff. Yeah.
You had said earlier that mushrooms are pretty gentle on folks who haven't done them a lot, and I just wanted to ask you, the second time that I did mushrooms, they were a lot of fun for the first third of the experience. And then the last 2/3, it was like entering this abyss, this great area of hollowness that was so empty. The only way I could describe it was that I had experienced what it feels like to live in the absence of love. And it was awful. It was just so awful. And so I'm trying to decide whether somebody can possibly had put something into these mushrooms because it doesn't seem like your normal mushroom trip to me. I mean,
Well, I don't know. It has a spectrum of possibility that's vast. And you know what they say, you don't get what you want, you get what you need. I mean, I don't know why anyone would need the trip that you describe. The way I approach it is, cannabis is an incredible navigation tool. And I described having these bombers rolled and in front of me. Those are essentially retro rockets for navigating up there. And when I get into a place I don't like, I just blast away and blast through it. And there are places I don't like that I encounter almost every time. I mean, there's a place in mushrooms that I call the meat locker. And it has me always reaching for the joint. I mean, it's like being trapped inside Francis Bacon's refrigerator or something. Something you don't even want to think about. The other thing is, and this is excellent advice, especially for white people, is sing. Sing. What we have a tendency to do when the going gets rough on psychedelics is to clench, to put your head down in your lap and say, you know, if it only lasts an hour, I can live through it if it doesn't get any worse. This is not the way to meet it when it goes dark. The way to meet it when it goes dark is to pull yourself up, sit in full lotus, and begin to sing. And begin to push oxygen through your body and begin to chant and take hold of the energy and take responsibility for the space. And behind chanting and cannabis, you can find your way past almost anything.
I had heard your tapes down in Mexico in the past few months, and you mentioned in it that Don Fidel was like a country doctor, you would say. And he had mentioned that the big power of ayahuasca, the medicine, is where the big trees were. I was wondering what that is. And then also other ayahuasqueros that do more than just what you might call be a country doctor. They might be more into getting in touch with the spirit or the source.
Yes, well, there's a poet in Peru named Cesar Calvo, and he wrote a book a few years ago called The Three Halves of Imo Mosho. And Ken Symington, who some of you know, I think, has translated this and is dickering with inner traditions to publish it. And it is the most amazing book about ayahuasca that I've ever read. I mean, I think Cesar Calvo is a candidate for the Nobel Prize because besides the fact that it's about ayahuasca, it's literature. It's not this horrible namby-pamby New Age narrative stuff. It's real literature. And what he does is he carries you into the world of the ayahuasqueros. And these guys are cosmic clowns. I mean, they're part of a network that stretches through time and space from who knows where to who knows where. They're cosmic jokesters. And he makes it very real. It's the best thing about ayahuasca I've seen, and I hope it comes out. I think, I mean, the way Don Fidel functioned, and this is what shamanism is about, is we tend to think of it as being this great-souled explorer of the unconscious. That's part of it. But the primary function of a shaman in a traditional society is to cure. They cure. And, you know, make of it what you will, you can read 12,000 pages of Carlos Castaneda and nobody cures anybody of anything. It doesn't seem to be about that. But shamanism at the village level is about curing. And then the extraordinary power of the shaman comes because he's outside the set of cultural values. Everyone else is living inside the illusion of witotoness, or Boranus or something like that. The shaman is a sophisticate. The shaman is primarily simply a human being because he has dissolved his boundaries so much that he sees under the cultural wiring of the particular culture that is in. That's how you do magic, you know? You do magic by being able to step outside the set of cultural expectations of the people that you are doing the magic for. Yeah, where was it? Did I say last night in the talk the thing about St. Thomas Aquinas and all that? Oh, well, here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, being able to do magic by stepping outside of a set of cultural expectations. Thomas Aquinas, this great doctor of the church, St. Augustine, also great doctor of the church, to prove his saintliness, they would come to him with books of theology, people who wanted to test his sanctity, and they would open the book in front of him, let him look at it for a few minutes, and then close the book. And lo and behold, he could tell people what was written in the book. And people fell down dead in the presence of this. They couldn't believe it. He was apparently the only man in Europe who knew how to read silently. That was the essence of his magic. Everyone else in Europe, presented with a page of scripture, would have to say, in nomine domini tuum et regnum confiat voluntas tuum. Okay, here's what it says. He could go, all right, here's what it says. And people were knocked off their feet by this performance. Magic. Because he had deconditioned himself from the cultural values, and so he could do something that appeared miraculous but was in fact utterly trivial. And a lot of shamanism rests on this. I mean, shamanism is essentially sophistication. That's why, in a sense, and people hate to hear me say this, but it's one of my fave raves, shamanism is a variety of skepticism. Shamans don't believe things. Shamans propagate beliefs. You know, they understand the provisional nature of belief. They build castles in the air of language that other people assume to be ferroconcrete and steel. And this is a great talent, a great thing. Yeah.
I heard a report, and I hope you can confirm it or deny it, about a conference of which Sasha Shulgin and you were attending with FDA representative, and Sasha was asking, you know, why the hallucinogens weren't rescheduled, and the reports were that the FDA representative said that they were suggesting that they be rescheduled. First of all, did this really take place? And second of all, what do you see before us in terms of rescheduling for research on the hallucinogens? Is there any light at the end of that particular tunnel, do you think?
Well, first of all, the incident you described, if it happened, I wasn't there. I haven't been at a conference with Sasha since the IT8 conference in Prague 2.5 years ago, and certainly nothing like that happened there. Rescheduling? I don't know. It's such a complex question. I mean, see, we think, or, you know, some of us think, that if we could just convince them that these things are important and good, that they would reschedule them. That's preposterous. They know what they are. They're perfectly aware of what it is. These scheduling laws are not there to keep you from jumping out of third-story windows. The whole thing is a little more complicated than that. Drugs are an incredible source of money for clandestine and covert intelligence operations. They are, in fact, the last major source of money. Where are you going to get a quick $1 billion if you need to destabilize a Southeast Asian country? It's not easy to push together a quick $1 billion off the books. There's only one business in the world that can do that, the dope business. And you know, criminal syndicalism, both government-sponsored and self-organized, has been using drugs as a foil for a very long time. If we were to make drugs legal, the major consequence of that, from the point of view of the people who rule this planet, is that it would be very hard to finance clandestine covert operations to influence the course of governments and history. It turns out it has nothing to do with what drugs do to you. It turns out it's a money issue, you see. So I don't really see it changing.
We got a red light flashing up there during the rest of this.
It's a firelight. Well, there's the door. Please don't trample each other. What was that sound, by the way?
Reverb.
What?
Reverb.
Reverb.
Spring reverb.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring us back to ayahuasca. It seems like such a deep subject. What have been your experiences of extreme, like just extreme terror, and then real positive brilliance? Like maybe you could share some personal experiences.
Well, the thing about ayahuasca that is so remarkable, I mean, each one of these substances has something about it that's remarkable. The thing that's so remarkable about ayahuasca is that it causes a synesthesia. It allows you to see sound. And this relates to what I was talking about this morning about visual languages. When you sing on ayahuasca, you're in a paint program of some sort. I mean, you make a tone. It's an iridescent blue ribbon that descends in the darkness and hangs there in the air. You switch tone and you can lay down a chartreuse line right next to it. Then you start singing. And as you explore what you can do, it's all visual. The sound is carrying the visual impression, and other people are seeing this. I mean, we have to do some experiments to determine exactly what they're seeing, but everyone is carried along. It's a performance. As far as, you know, my own personal experiences with it and the heights and the depths, if you make it strong with a lot of tryptamine, it comes in a wave that is pretty irresistible. I think the strongest I ever saw it, I just felt it began to flow past me. And then it began to flow past faster and faster. And finally, I actually began to feel it like a wind. And I felt like I was swept out to sea. And there was a period when I lost consciousness. And when I came to, I felt literally washed up on the beach. I could feel that I was lying on a beach. And I could feel that my face was pushed into the sand. And I just lay there quietly, assessing whether or not I'd survived the first wave of this thing. And then I heard this crunching in the sand behind me. And someone came up behind me and put their foot in the middle of my back and pushed me further into the sand. And then the whole impression was replaced by something else. But it was a very weird kind of encounter. Mainly what ayahuasca is are beautiful hallucinations going on against black backgrounds. Psilocybin hallucinations and DMT hallucinations fill the space. It's filled with hallucinations. On ayahuasca, the hallucinations are projected onto the black space, and it's incredibly subtle. I mean, the colors, the palette can range from, you know, extraordinary electric polychrome type colors down through, you know, exquisite pastels, peaches, salmons, mauve, this kind of thing, lacework, languages, hieroglyphs. I had one ayahuasca trip where I seemed to be in the Great Pyramid, and all I could see were black Egyptian hieroglyphics on a gold ground, and light, like flashlight light, showing these things to me as I was walking past. The difference generally, I think, between ayahuasca and psilocybin is the mushroom is somewhat megalomaniacal. It's all about the end of human history, the collective departure from the earth, enormous machines from another dimension, galactic destiny, you know, trumpet fanfares, the last days, the liftoff, the breakthrough. It's like that. Ayahuasca is not like that at all. Ayahuasca is about rivers and animals and birth and death and affection and social tension and struggle and the earth, simply. I mean, and it's extraordinary because they're so chemically similar, and yet the emotional feeling is very, very different. I mean, the psilocybin is the most science fiction-y, with the possible exception of DMT, which sort of lies outside categories. But the psilocybin is very, very futuristic and apocalyptarian, mechanistic, galactic in its perspective, these alien messages and hieroglyphs and this sort of thing. And ayahuasca is more like what I think people who have never taken hallucinogens think hallucinogens are like. In other words, beautiful, undulating patterns, emotions moving through you, revelations of heartfulness, resolutions to be a better person and to do better, and insight into your own life, your plans, not the kind of abrasive insight that LSD gives you, which is usually about recovering, you know, oh my God, X, Y, and Z happened to me in the past, but more, you know, where do I want to be, and who do I want to be, and who do I want to be it with kind of thinking. And the mushroom, as I say, has a much more general, it tells you things. Ayahuasca is like the eye of a camera. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's just a flying camera. And after a good ayahuasca trip, you just feel like your eyes are bugging out of your head. You know, you've been looking and looking and looking and looking and looking at stuff for hours under the influence of this. So it's a very different in that way. Yeah.
Each time that I've taken it, I've always kept my eyes open and listened to the teachings of the guide or the master. And I found that by keeping my eyes open, I was able to really absorb more. It wasn't so much a trick, it was more of a tool. It felt more of like a teaching tool and also like a purification that was going on. And a few times that I would close my eyes, I felt then I would go off to another place in a more tricky way. So for me, it was more to keep your eyes open. Do you experiment both with your eyes open and closed, or do you prefer one or the other?
Well, I'm pretty partial to eyes closed. I guess this just has to do with my personal biases and how I was raised. But to me, the proof that you are not dealing with yourself is the hallucinations. I know the contents of my mind, and I know what I can conceive of and what I cannot conceive of. And when I'm sitting there in silent darkness being showed thing after thing that I could never conceive of, I freely admit this can't possibly be coming from me. So, and a lot of people have argued with me about this and say, you know, you just set up this artificial value system, and then because you're into hallucinations, you diss everybody else's trip. Because, for instance, what LSD often does is it makes you think strange things. The mind rushes, and there's all kinds of ideas, perceptions, but not exactly visions. And to my mind, I'm just fascinated by hallucinations. I just think they're the most amazing things. They are as close to a miracle as I ever hope to get. I mean, where is that stuff coming from? You know, on a good mushroom rush, in 45 or 50 minutes, I have the impression that I see more art than the human species has created in the last 12,000 years. And where does this stuff come from? If I could capture a single 30-second burst, I could be Peter Max, Yves Saint Laurent, Salvador Dali, Pablo Picasso, and all the rest of them rolled into one. Because the amount of creative imagery is staggering. And as artists, I think this is what we should all be challenged by. I would like graphic artists to go in there. These are the people we need to send. You know, these are the people with a unique talent that can serve the rest of us. We can't send instruments with cameras the way we would to Mars or the moons of Jupiter. No, we have to send artists preferably with eidetic memories, who can take snapshots and come back and with airbrush, oil, and computer render these things. We need to try and create a grammar of hallucinogenesis, probably in a computer environment. We need to try and understand what the laws are that rule these visual transforms. Because this is an endless font of images for design and, God forbid, fashion, advertising, the whole thing. I mean, clearly we are dragging images out of the unconscious, but I dare say if we could access the psychedelic unconscious, there would be few rooms around that look like this one. This is a room created out of the assumptions of linear print culture and Bauhaus economics. But there are other ways to do it, and that's what the hallucinogens make so explicit. Yeah?
It's about a midpoint now. You want to take a break?
Sure.
About 4 o'clock, I guess?
That's fine. Let's take a break. It's 3:40. Let's take a 20-minute break.